I'll try not to.
All right. Did you guys all have a good week?
Great week.
Excellent. So we are recording now. And remember, don't put anything online that you don't want to have come back and haunt you. Always a good rule to live by, especially if you are considering a life in politics. I don't know. I think that if somebody's career is going to be absolutely destroyed because of their own stupidity, then they kind of deserve it. That's just a general observation. It doesn't have anything to do with anything that we have anything to do with talking about. Okay. And I am keying this up. We are a little bit all over the place today. We're talking about things that happened at about the same time, but I kind of like the way they are counterpoint to each other, because one is a style that, I mean, it looks fresh, it looks energetic, but it was used with the rather negative consequences. And then the others are just four architectural styles that are a lot more hopeful. And I thought that the two fit together pretty well. So I want to share this with you. Hold on, okay, let's do this. Sigh. Okay, here we go. All right, so hopefully everybody can see this painting here. This is a painting that was done, I believe, about 1909. And this is by an Italian futurist painter named Umberto Boccioni. And there's a lot to it that is very reminiscent of Cubism. That I think we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But it came from a very, very different place. And I wanted to share a video with you that kind of puts this thing into perspective. And then we'll talk about Cubism and stuff like that and how things are different. I really love that Monty Python clip because, well, for one reason, it's just funny. But one thing that I really enjoy about it is that it talks about, in a humorous way, sometimes the very real consequences of generations not being able to communicate. Sometimes there's a lot of stress between generations. And it seems like cultural momentum vacillates back and forth between respecting those who have come before and wanting to make a clean break from the people that have come before. And sometimes that can translate into violent conflict, and sometimes that can be manifested with opportunities to actually discuss and learn from each other. And what we're looking at is a transition time. And, you know, like I said before, it's very convenient to stuff all the styles into a timeline. It's not very accurate. It doesn't reflect reality at all. People are communicating all the time. They're talking back and forth. They're coming up with new ideas, different ideas, all this kind of stuff. And what we see is a blending of styles as perspectives shift and change, and as priorities alter. I can see that there's a lot of opportunity for generations not being able to communicate at this time in the world, because, like we were talking about last week, there is an awful lot of change going on, technological, as well as just perspective change. You know, people saying that, you know, the world is a much bigger place than they might be comfortable with dealing with. In 1909, there was an Italian poet who was just minding his own business, driving along in his new car, and he almost collided with two people on motorcycles or bicycles. Excuse me. Remember we were talking? Did we talk about bicycle face a couple weeks ago? Do you remember that? Yeah, and so he avoided running him over and was struggling getting his car out of a ditch, and it just came to him that these two kinds of ideas, the relatively non-technological idea of slow progress and the new dynamic progress represented with machine culture at the time, he felt that they were completely incompatible. This guy's name was Filippo Tommaso Marinati, and he went home and in a flurry of insight wrote a manifesto, including 11 points, where he decried all of the dragging weight of the old world. And I want to share this with you. And from our perspective now, 115 years later, a lot of these points seem really laughable, and some of them some of them are really terrible because we can see what they led to. But it's interesting to me to get this glimpse into the perspective of this person in 1909 talking about the struggle between a future of machines and technology and the past of really limited scope and ideas. So you can see I'm sharing this document with you too. I'd like everybody to at least scan it, and even if you don't read the whole thing, get down to his 11 points. Where he says, we want to sing the love of danger, the habit of energy and rashness. Number 2 is the essential elements of poetry will be courage, audacity, and revolt. And number 3 is working against the pensive immobility of previous outdated literature, celebrating aggression, feverish sleeplessness, and the double march. And for some reason, this reminds me, do you guys know who Christoph Waltz is? The Austrian actor who was in Inglourious Bastards. And okay, several times he's been asked in interviews, what's the difference between Austria and Germany? Because he's very clear to point out that he's Austrian, he's not German. And he says the difference between Austria and Germany is the difference between the waltz and the goose step. And that comes to mind when I'm reading this, thinking about the old world taking place with this violent, energetic new world. And number 4, the splendor of the world is enriched by new beauty, which is the beauty of speed. Number 5, we want to sing of the man at the wheel. Number 6, the poet must spend himself with warmth, glamour, and prodigality to increase the enthusiastic fervor of the primordial elements. And think of this period of time. This is shortly before World War I, and this comes back with fervor, about 20 years later, as the Christian retrenchment movement in Germany morphs into Nazism, and they prepare to try to take over the world. Number 7, beauty exists only in struggle. Number 8, we are on the extreme promontory of the centuries. And it talks about the mysterious shutters of the impossible. Time and space died yesterday. So there's a bit of the nihilism of Nietzsche in here too. Number 9, we want to glorify war. Number 10, we want to demolish museums and libraries, fight morality, feminism, and all opportunist and utilitarian cowardice. And number 11, we will sing of the great crowds agitated by work, pleasure, and revolt. This is what fueled the futurist artists and designers. And again, I want to show this painting. Oh. I'm sorry, all my little tabs and stuff are going crazy. Looking at this painting, even though it does have a lot of strong resemblance to the cubism that we were looking at earlier, there are some underlying tensions to it that it's always kind of disturbed me a little bit, because it is different than cubism. Some of it almost feels darkly humorous, but reading that manifesto and then how that governed how the Futurist artists thought about their own work, it puts a whole different perspective on it. And this is one of those cases where I really don't like learning about what the artists thought about their own stuff. I'd rather overlay my own meaning on it. You know, it just, that really kind of makes me uncomfortable. And then this is by contrast what I wanted to share with you. This is why I wanted to share the early architectural movements of the 20th century. We look at this. This is a house front by Antoni Gaudi in Art Nouveau style. And by contrast, where the Futurists wanted to destroy the morality of the past and celebrated the violence of conflict, we look at this. Can you sense a difference in design sensibility and worldview? Can anybody see that? Just the really strong contrast. What I read is a touch of organic style, you know, touching on nature instead of celebrating technology. And it's not, there's nothing wrong with celebrating technology, but the Futurists were celebrating technology as a machine with which to destroy the past. And I don't see that here. I don't feel that at all. Some of the other architectural movements we're going to look at dealt with the celebration of craftsmanship and the human touch on form, and which I think is really remarkable. And again, I like that because of the strong contrast against that Futurist manifesto. What do you guys think about that? You know, looking at that painting and then listening to or reading just a little bit of the Futurist manifesto. How is it similar to Cubism that we've looked at last week, and how is it different?
So I think did a really good job helping me be a little bit more thoughtful about it. You know, like you're opening with Monty Python and just sort of you know, talking about how they were rejecting the past. And so I've just kind of been trying to sit in that for a minute because, you know, again, I think with hindsight, knowing what became of these fascists, what became of their movement and the atrocities that were committed, you know, in hindsight, it's like, it's really easy to look back and think it's stupid. But I hadn't really like spent a lot of time thinking about what that would have been like before that, you know, without knowing what was going to come, just being caught up in the fever of it. And so anyway, I'm just kind of stuck there for a minute, just thinking about that. And it just sort of feels like, you know, like teenage angst, like almost like punk rock, like just like establishment and just, you know, not know, you know, if you take it out of what we know happened, you know, it's kind of it's such a weird art movement. Like you said, the art doesn't align with the, you know, the many manifestos that came out of this. It's sort of weird. I have a hard time reconciling those things, you know, but.
Yeah, it's really an interesting confrontation between what the art was and how we view it today, and what the manifesto was and what the artist claimed to be intending. I think that's fascinating. Brittany.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the Cubists were sort of
I'm sorry.
doing that with art movement.
Yeah.
We're attaching it to like violence, you know? And so I don't know, it's like all this extra stuff that comes along with it. It's just really hard to, a lot of extra baggage.
Yeah, a lot of baggage. Excellent. Yes, Brittany.
So I was just thinking about like the picture that you showed us and the sharp angles and stuff. And with that manifesto, I don't know, it brings out the aggression and stuff. Like it makes it feel more menacing. And especially when you compare it to the architecture of the building with the organic flowing, more peaceful feel. And so I don't know, it just kind of makes me sad that they wanted to use art as a way of destruction, which I know art's always been used as a political move or with agendas and stuff like that. But it just kind of makes me sad.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. There's always this element of battling against the past. You know, whenever people move forward, whenever they put their names or put a label on a new movement that everybody's decided, they want to do away with the past. But the artists that last are the ones that are commenting on the past and building on it, rather than just merely destroying it. It's the idea of Kali in Hinduism. Kali, you know, all of us know, when we've been so thoroughly educated in the American system, watching all the Harrison Ford movies, that Kali is this incredibly horrible, destructive goddess. But what she actually represents is the cycles of life, that things have to die and decay so that new life can be generated. So she's not just a harbinger of death, but she is the angel of time. You know, she's the one who reminds us it's okay when our pet dog dies, because life continues. They're puppies. And when I look at Cubism, that's the kind of perspective that I get, rather than the Indiana Jones version of Kali. And with Cubism, people are looking at things from multiple perspectives, and they want to share those multiple perspectives with us. And with Futurism, there's something very similar. There's a lot of the same kind of angles, except the multiple perspectives are focused on multiple points of time, with the celebration of movement and underlining of technology. So it's something subtle going on, and I don't feel that it's always negative, or it doesn't seem to me to feel that it's pushing towards violence. But it's really interesting to me that that's one of these underlying features behind it, you know, underlying mentality. So rather than viewing Kali as the goddess of cycles, in that case, goddess Kali would be the terrifying figure of the night, who's out to hurt people, essentially. You know, celebrating the destruction of the morality of the old. And you know, this, even though fascism is not the same as nationalist Nazism, but it's interesting to me that as that Christian retrenchment movement kind of lost its way and became Hitler's Nazism, a lot of those ideas, a lot of those futurist ideas were adapted and used by, you know, the militaristic dictators of Germany. And I agree with Joey. Teenage angst is, I think, what underscored that manifesto. You know, written by a 33-year-old, but still it reads as teenage angst. And I think it morphed into something a lot worse than what any of its proponents expected. You know, going back to I really love this. This is one of my favorite Cubist paintings. I think it's absolutely beautiful. Gene Metzinger's still life with fruits. It's gorgeous. And I can see those different perspectives of time. And and I can read it, or it's comfortable for me to read it as a symbol of different perspectives of the world. You know, this idea of phenomenology where your own observation is vital because it impacts our shared reality. And then when we start looking at Umberto Boccioni's work, it starts transforming into something very different. That earlier painting that I shared with you is called The Dynamism of a Soccer Player. And what is interesting to me is I can kind of see some of what I love about that Cubist work by Gene Metzinger. But now that I can reframe this in what Umberto was a proponent of, this red and the harsh angles feel less like distinct moments in time, and they start taking on a flavor of something a little bit darker. And it makes me really, what's sad is it makes me really uncomfortable now. and I can't go back to the joy I used to find in the Futurism. But I wanted to, there is a video that I wanted to share. I have several videos in here. And again, I'm apologizing beforehand if when I share a video, it's edited out of our class thing. Just go back and watch the video yourself. But I think that this is a pretty good description of Futurism through the observation of this one painting. And we're not going to watch all 11 minutes. We're going to only watch the first couple minutes.
This is a very silly painting. I see a bottom of a woman's dress and a dog on a leash scurrying along, one of those little long wiener dogs.
It looks kind of silly, but maybe the way in which these silly things are painted is not so silly. Maybe it's silly. It's an Italian futurist work by a man named Giacomo Balla.
Okay, that's all that I wanted to watch of that. And I do recommend that you go through and watch the entire critique of this painting. When we look at, let's do our own critique though of it. Do you see any relation to what the Cubists were doing? Can you guys see that relation? There is a very definite, powerful relation and link to Cubism. What I'm seeing in this is the leash. There's 4 distinct leashes. I see, just like there's Edward Maybridge images, I see overlays of moments of time with the woman's feet walking, especially with the tail wagging and the dog's feet moving. And what I'm also seeing, though, is rather than those snapshots of different times in the background, like we see in the still life paintings, the Cubist still life paintings, we see a lot of these strong straight lines. They're narrow, but they are strong, and we still use this in advertising, animation, and imagery today to denote movement and lines. And so what I'm seeing in this is several different shots of the feet, several different shots of the legs and the tail, but pretty much only one image for the body, only one image for the skirt. And I'm seeing these dynamic animation, almost animation lines that with the diagonal, even though they're not strongly diagonal, the diagonal is still there all through it. It feels to me that if this was Cubist, the Cubist painter was only interested in communicating moments of time that indicated movement. You know, this kind of active movement. Are you guys seeing any of that as well? What do you see?
Yeah, I see that. And even in like the difference in edge quality, like you can see on the edge of the dog's back where maybe back up walk, like the edge versus other things harder line, I think so indicates the movement. You know, like over by his head, you know, the lines are a little harder around his nose, but on his back, by his tail, fuzzier. I think that kind of adds to the repetition of the shapes too.
Now, your voice was cutting out quite a bit, but it sounded like you're talking about there's the fuzziness around the dog's body and the sharpness around the dog's head. And that by contrast, it helped to emphasize the apparent movement in the little wiener dog legs. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So in addition to the repetitive shapes, it's also different edge qualities might indicate movement of an area too. I think. Yeah, and like you can see around his ear, it's just kind of fuzzy rather than the total repeating shape of it. It just the edges too. I don't know how to word it quite right, but
no, yeah, I can see that, but there's almost a cartoon quality of emphasis for the movement, and I can really see somebody walking their dog while they're trying to behave in a mature manner, walking rather quickly, and the little dog's legs just going like there's no tomorrow, very excited, tail wagging, leash whipping around, and it's to me it's a happy painting. You know, it is happy. I don't feel a lot of that darkness that I read from the manifesto. You know, which I'm grateful for that. So another one that I wanted to show is another artist that I wanted to share is Umberto Boccioni. And this person's work, he really defined the Futurists, at least in our contemporary minds. He's really helped to define what the Futurists stood for, visually. You know, again, I learned about this artwork. I really enjoyed seeing it because I felt that it was an Italian continuation of what the Spanish, the French, and the Americans were doing with Cubism. And I didn't realize how it fed into, future fascism. But I still appreciate this stuff just because of the forms. But I want to share with you kind of, this is another extrapolation of Futurism, looking at the work of one individual. And let me, this will help if I get the sound on. So give me just a second here.
The first artist we're dealing with when it comes to Futurism is going to be Boccioni, who created the definitive work of Futurist sculpture. And it's kind of a difficult one to wrap your head around, at least until we start breaking it down. So let's look at unique forms of continuity in space.
Now, before we watch the rest of this is that sculpture that we're talking about. And what I am seeing is something that is related, in at least visually for me, I see a direct correlation between this sculpture and Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. I see a very specific, very direct correlation. But I also see some changes that Boccioni has done to Marcel Duchamp's idea. It feels to me that in the sculptural form, he is bringing out different aspects of somebody walking. But the differences that I see is the flaring and the continuity of shapes, the connectedness seem to be built around a very powerful figure walking very dynamically forward. This figure feels like it is leaning into the future, into a wind, pressing against it. It reminds me of elements that I see in like maybe like what a gladiator might wear. I see a gladiatorial helmet in there. I see ideas of armor. I see something of a militaristic stance. And for me, you know, in the years before reading the manifesto, what I saw was somebody marching forward into a future despite whatever pressures might be pushing them back. And so I thought it was, in my mind, it was almost celebratory, you know, of going forward through hardship. So let's, well, before continuing on, does anybody else see any of that as well? I see this powerful figure moving forward. Okay, let's watch the rest of this.
And what we see is this massive life-size bronze sculpture. It highlights formal and spatial effects of motion rather than their source. So we're not looking for the source of the motion. When you think about Michelangelo and he depicts someone as moving, we're always going to see the source of that movement. In other words, we're going to see certain muscles tensed, and that tells us that that person is moving, that the subject is moving. What Boccione is doing here is he's actually showing us the spatial effect of the motion, what's happening in space, rather than where the motion is coming from. And what is that motion? Well, he's actually running. When you look at the piece, what you want to do is break it down, because imagine that we're seeing all of these images overlapped as if they're double exposed, or in this case, 10 times exposed. The figure becomes distorted and broken, so it becomes a blur of its own motion. As we look at it, we can actually start to break it down along those lines. Now here, obviously, we have a front view, so I'll put a little F there. And here we're seeing it from the side. And what you're actually seeing is multiple views of the same thing. For example, the shin of this front leg. The front leg is coming from a position in back where it's coming down and planting so that the body can come over the top. And what we're seeing is the shin is here, and then the shin is here, and then the shin is here, and then the shin appears to be here. It's giving us that idea that we're seeing multiple images at the same time, giving us that sense of movement, really trying to capture motion blur in bronze. Why would he want to do that? Well, think about how unusual the concept really is. You can't blur bronze, not like you can a painting. You can't capture that sense of motion, but he's trying to do exactly that. Let's pick other areas. For example, the hips. So here we'll look at the other side. We see the hip and that swing of the hip down into the buttock, where the hips are moving back and forth as he runs, the right hip coming forward, then the left hip coming forward as he's moving. He's breaking down not.
And I just want to stop and pause for just a moment. We're talking about art. This is an art history class. So I really hope that nobody's offended when they're talking about anatomy in an art history class, okay? I don't want anybody's feelings to be hurt. So thought I should just say that.
Not the form itself, not the person, but rather the movement. And we see the same thing with the leg. Here's a calf for the rear leg. It repeats there. It repeats here. So we're seeing it come forward. We see the same thing. Here's the musculature, for example, the hamstring, where we can see that tensed muscle. We know that that is a functioning muscle. So we know that he's trying to push forward. So we get this incredible sense of movement. And as we look at it closer, even the face is trying to capture a sense of movement. Now, he's simplified the face because when you're running, imagine someone sprinting past you. It's very difficult to make out the details of the face. So instead, he's giving us bare basic sort of breaking it down to abstract concepts. Here's the eyes. Here's that line every artist uses from the eyes and the head down to the chin and the mouth, where you lay out everything. Here's the concept of the nose, but it's back here because, of course, that face is moving side to side as he's running along. And this piece becomes symbolic of the futurist desire to capture the dynamic qualities of modern life. They're trying to capture this movement in a media in which movement has never really been captured before. So they're using these cubist ideas to break down movement instead of breaking down and analyzing form. And you come up with this, which really is capturing running, capturing movement.
So think about what we just saw. How amazing is that? I mean, that's astounding. Have any of you worked with bronze? I taught bronze at BYU for a bit. Can I tell you a really gross story? Is that okay? Okay. Bronze, you have to melt it to about 22 to 2400 degrees. It gets so hot, you can feel it about 40 feet away. You can start feeling the heat about 40 feet away. And it's so bright that you'll get burn spots in your eyes if you look right at the molten bronze. But it's so hot that when you add more cold bronze or solid bronze to the crucible, you have to set it on the side of the crucible for a while so that bronze can heat up slowly. It needs to do that because the temperature change in metal, if there's a dramatic temperature change, you know, when you hold a glass with or a cup with ice in it on a typical St. George day where your skin is melting, there is all this moisture that forms around the colder glass right away. And a reason for that is because the temperature differential forces water to liquefy from its gas state on the lower state material, the colder material. And with bronze, when you put the cold bronze next to the hot bronze, you get a lot of that water condensing on the cooler bronze because of dramatic temperature change or temperature difference. So you have to set the cold bronze on the edge of the crucible. As the bronze heats up, that water has an opportunity to dissipate again and turn into gas. So if you are not paying attention and you drop that cold bronze, that solid bronze, into the 2400 degrees bronze without allowing the water to change or to dissipate, what happens is that very rapidly the water condenses on the cold bronze and then turns into gas in a split second. What do you think that does to the molten bronze? Yeah, Van, exactly. When you're casting as well, you wear this asbestos suit that makes it look like you're in an Elton John music video. And you have to have these greaves that cover the tops of your feet. You have to have chaps that cover the forward part of your body. A friend of mine had thought he was wearing the right kind of clothes. It was still hot enough that his acrylic jogging suit started melting to his skin. So you want to wear jeans, you want to wear cotton wool. Things don't melt really quickly. So in all that, with his safety gear, a friend of mine who had gotten to Washington University told, and this was a story that I always told all my students so they would make sure that they paid attention to the safety rules and wore all the right stuff. He said that this kid not only was not wearing his greaves to protect the tops of his boots, he didn't think he needed to because he was wearing work boots, you know, leather. What can possibly melt through leather, you know? And he just dumped an ingot, a cold ingot, into the crucible, and then stepped back really quick, thinking that everything would be fine and it would be fun to watch the bronze spit up. Well, shot a glob of bronze about a little bit smaller than a golf ball, so about that big, shot it up into the air, 15 feet up in the air, and one of these blobs landed on the guy's foot. He didn't think of anything of it because he didn't feel anything. So he goes to move, and he realizes he can't move his foot, looks down, the bronze burnt right through, that fast, it burnt right through his boot, through his entirety of his foot, and through the sole of his boot, and then cooled down the moment it hit the cement. And it left a shape that looked like a parabolic curve right through his foot. So he had to lift his foot up. And of course, he didn't do any more casting that day. He went to the hospital, but he didn't even feel anything until the next day because it happened that fast. Anyways, that whole story is just to underscore the idea that when people give you safety parameters to follow, it's a good idea to listen. But looking at Umberto Boccioni's, that sculpture, I really love how he says this is motion blur in bronze. That's not something you can think of. To show movement in bronze, you show the dynamism of the human form, either immediately preceding or immediately after a movement. Nobody's ever thought of showing those hallmarks of movement in the process before. And I think that's absolutely astounding. What are your guys' takes? What do you think about it?
Andrew?
Yeah.
I think I've never thought that when seeing that sculpture before, how interesting it is to see movement in a solid object. And when it's broken down, like in the video when he was breaking it down in level to level with the shin, with the hamstring, really interesting to think about the concept of identifying movement in something that is inadequately solid.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. And from that story, I was thinking about that for a couple other reasons, but one of them is that bronze is not forgiving. If you screw up when you're casting, that's it. You've got to melt it down and start over. With paint, especially oil paint, one of the reasons I think that oil paint is so incredible is because you can keep tweaking it until you're finally happy with it, or until you get to a point where you realize any more energy is you're going to miss what you're trying to say. And with bronze, I think the difference is Cubism demonstrates different moments of time all at once, and Futurism was trying to demonstrate the capturing of the process of moments, not individual moments displayed, but the whole process of movement. And it's a difference that's kind of hard to see, but once you start seeing it, it's really hard not to see it anymore. And it's astounding to me. So when we go back and look at the magic wiener dog, I love that painting. I think it's awesome. Let's see. I'm going to go back to this. That's something that Giacomo Balla did. We look at some of his other paintings, and these are swirls. It does feel like it's in that kind of network or grid of Cubism, but instead of sharing with us distinct moments that are collected, I really can see that he's trying to share with us the whole process of movement as it's continuing. And I think that's absolutely amazing. I think that Cubism is like layering Edward Maybridge's studies over on top of each other. And then Futurism is actually capturing those motion blurs. And I think it's a little bit different, and I can see how that might be confusing, but it is distinct enough that I think it's a fascinating way of just portraying the world around you. I think it's really amazing. Now there's another video that I wanted to share. It's called Armored Train. And this one, I think more of those ideas are starting to come out, that the Futurist Manifesto. I think Gino Severini, I don't know if you guys ever saw David Suchet in his the mystery TV series he did for BBC. It was I'm sorry, it's a Belgian detective who solves really complicated cases with style. Let me see if I can find out. Oh, Poirot, that's it. Have you guys seen the BBC productions of Poirot? David Suchet plays this Belgian detective. But the reason why I'm thinking of that is that the whole opening sequence is a very dynamic kind of cubist / futurist depiction of this early 20th century. And he's active from right before World War I into World War II. And I think it's a pretty good selection of the kind of shifting perspectives that were prevalent in Europe for the time. But let me share this with you. This is Gino Severini, and we'll watch as much of this as we need to.
Severini loved the idea of the cleansing power of war. He loves the idea that war.
Okay, right off the bat, that is a very distinctly different perspective than we saw with the Cubists. And we can see in this image just by itself, here's gunnery sights. You know, here's an emblem, a tail emblem for an airplane. You know, and there's some of these other things going on.
Somehow eliminates those historical artifacts that hold us back and eliminates those members of society that aren't, well, as he would see it, necessary. This is going to be a bit ironic later on, but we'll get to that. So he creates armored train. Now, this encapsulates the Futurist program. Here we see a high-tech armored train. And let me remind you that armored trains are kind of the big fancy new toy that each of these nations has. These are huge. We see big cannons and everything else. Basically, armored trains, the idea behind them is I'm going to put giant guns on it and lots of troops with machine guns and other things. I'm going to run it right through the enemy nation and obliterate everything in its path. Of course, there's a little shortcoming to this plan, which is, of course, in a time of war, the first thing you do is blow up the railroad connections to the nation that's going to run an armored train through. But either way, leading up to World War I, this is the thing that they show off. People crowd around and want to see the brand new technology in armored trains. And so that's why Severini is going to use it as the basis for his painting. So here we see death and destruction omitted, and colors are bright to focus on the cleansing effect of war, as if they're firing daisies into the countryside, cleansing it of all those dirty things like people and buildings. They might as well be firing Tide Pods for all it's worth. But this captures the dynamicism and motion central to futurism. All of the objects here are broken into facets, very much from the Cubist influence. And as we look at it, you'll notice the color schemes. They're firing bright blues and primary and secondary colors into the landscape. Nothing here seems dangerous. Nothing here seems, well, to indicate massacre. There we would expect tones of red and black and gray, but we're not seeing any of that. Each of the figures is broken into cubist facets, the uniforms primarily being broken up. The rifles, of course, we see an indication of them, but they're just sort of an indication. We know that they're there. We know that they're rifles. He doesn't need to show us. The turrets of the guns, of course, are in the cubist form, where we're seeing different sides at the same time. For example, this opening in the turret needs to be seen from the front. That's the most interesting and identifiable pose they can take. But the barrel is seen from the side. Of course, if you look down the barrel of a gun, it's kind of boring. It's like a big metal donut firing freedom seeds into the distance. At least that's what I imagine the futurists would be saying. the colors, the forms all get across this very positive aspect of war, one that we don't typically think of when we think of war. And we're going to see a very polar opposite to this when we get to German new objectivity, which will happen after the war. Now, ironically, or somewhat obviously, I guess, futurism will break up as World War I progresses, since many of the artists will feel drawn to combat and die as part of the cleansing effect of war that you would expect, although futurism will be attached to Mussolini and fascism after the war, those that continue, such as Bocchini. And consequently, we see futurism being associated with fascism, and so futurism really falls out of style. It's why it's skipped over so often in art history.
That idea of the cleansing effect of war and shooting freedom seeds into the future, I kind of like that, because it puts kind of a humorous face on this really idealist vision of what the world should be. And I think when Joey was talking about that teenage angst, in my family, all the kids, we had that teenage angst. We want to get rid of the old, move forward with the new. And then the moment you realize you've got to eat somehow, and that means participating in the old in so much as you're getting a job and trying to follow the rules, that it's really kind of a nasty wake up, because you can't, you've been depending on the handouts from your parents and you can't anymore. And I wanted to share this thing with you from alchemical tradition, which ties in with what we just saw with the armored train. This is a really powerful image of the process of knowledge, and that kind of inherent irony that experimentation results in destruction. When we look at these images, this is what alchemists used to demonstrate their awareness that experimentation and dissection involved the destruction of whatever you were examining. And it's the green lion of knowledge, where in trying to find out something, you would destroy it. And a lot of the times, these kinds of illustrations, sun meant wisdom, and the alchemist a lot of the times would paint this with the jaws of the lion drawing blood from the sun. And it wasn't intended to be a negative thing. It was intended to illustrate the awareness that we have to be careful as we learn, because a lot of the times the process of learning can result in the destruction of the elements that we're trying to understand. I don't get that awareness with that armored train. It just seems to be the celebration of, going through the countryside and shooting freedom seeds into the future. But rather than looking at, I also have Carlo Cara as another artist there. And it does make sense that a lot of that futurist art would fall out of favor, because if you lose the war, nobody's going to be really interested in continuing a celebration of all those things that led to the war. So I can really see that. And the reality is too, a lot of those early futurist artists stopped producing work, oddly enough, after they were killed on the battlefield, which meant we don't have a lot of art surviving from whatever they would have done otherwise. And I part of me is kind of glad that Futurist Manifesto really was forced to confront reality. And but the legacy of that idea, perceptualizing movement in the way that they did, I think is really a remarkable perspective to have. And I hope that that's the thing that we can see and remember from this movement. And I wanted to, we don't have an awful lot of time, and that's fine. I'll put up the rest of this stuff online when we're done, so you guys can look at these things. I wanted to touch on the architecture of the time from elsewhere in Europe is something that I think is, by contrast, really delightful. And we're talking a period of about 1890 to 1920. So a lot of this overlaps quite a bit of what the Cubists were doing, as well as the Futurists. But I think that this is a very different perspective, and I love the difference. The four different styles I want to look at are Art Nouveau, Expressionism, Prairie Style, and early Modernism. I think we've talked before how frustrating it is. Some of these terms that artists and art historians come up with, they should be synonyms, but they're not. They're given specific labels. So modern should be a synonym to contemporary, but it's not. Modernism in painting really goes from about 1920 to 1970. And throughout the 60s, it transformed into postmodernism, which on the surface of it, I think is ridiculous because postmodernism should be in the future, right? I mean, because if modernism is now, postmodernism should be in the future, but that's just not the way it is. And it's on one hand, it's a little disappointing and a little confusing, but we'll talk about that. There are, in my mind, just going to touch a little bit on modernism, because modernism morphs into something more of a period that I think undertakes to break from a lot of the traditions of the past and try to find a future. And we do see a lot of different things taking place within an umbrella of a broader term of modernism. So I want to focus primarily on Art Nouveau, Expressionism as it relates to architecture, and then Prairie Style. So let's look at this really quick. I don't know how much of this we'll have time for. I don't think actually, let's not play the video. I'm just going to go through and look at different shots of the video. Now this, do any of you know what this style, who the engineers of this style were in stained glass? This is a lot of the time this is referred to Tiffany style as Tiffany style, because Louis Tiffany at the end of the 19th century, his parents bought him a glass factory. It was a glass factory in Indiana. Let's see. Kokomo, Indiana. And it's this is the first time where people started actually making stained glass where the colors were shifting through the stained glass. The earlier stained glass we saw, we can see, is primarily four principal colors. It's red, green, and blue with clear. So I guess that's not really a color, but they add silver stain to it to turn it yellow. And then all the other colors we see are painting on it. And what marks this as different and unique that really leads into the Art Nouveau era is that Lalique and Tiffany were creating glass that was opalescent. And you can see the kind of shifting colors within the glass. This isn't because of applied paint. This is right here. And you can kind of see the gray that is applied to it, give it a little bit of a texture. But what we're looking at that's so remarkable is this shift in color from this kind of amber and pink into a blue because of the way the glass is made. And this is a completely new invention of late 19th century. Art Nouveau really looked at organic elements of nature around it and tried to incorporate that into supreme craftsmanship. So it was an opportunity for craftspeople to really celebrate the work that they did. Anybody guess who this artist is, who was one of the godfathers of Art Nouveau painting? His name is Alphonse Mucha. He was a Hungarian. He moved to France, and he loved doing posters for the theater. And he loved designing set pieces and silverware and hair designs. And so these kinds of crowns. Have any of you seen the illustrations to the original L. Frank Baum Oz books, like Ozma of Oz? They was Art Nouveau illustrators really gravitated to the art books, or to the Oz books that Baum was doing, because it was this kind of futuristic fantasy. And they loved the idea of a romantic fantasy that was futuristic, but still had its roots in the most idealized portions of the past. And so if you get an opportunity to look at L. Frank Baum Oz books and look at the kind of designs that were developed for those and the illustrations. But there is, I don't know, you can see this kind of celebration of abstracted florals, this inlay in the woods of several different kinds of wood to kind of celebrate this idea of nature coming in. And you can see the way that the wood is kind of generated or grown out from the body of the cabinet. This is in everything from design and wallpaper to Antoni Gaudi used it in his architecture, where this starts to feel almost as if the cement itself is growing into or growing almost like wood or coral. And it's absolutely astounding. Antoni Gaudi really loved colors of glass too. So you can see he used a lot of glass, not to make kind of scenes so much, but to celebrate the way that the glass could be made into plates or saucers or forms, where he's kind of celebrate the natural shapes of the glass as opposed to trying to create a narrative. And here, this is, as we go into the UK, there's quite a bit of overlap of time, but there's this celebration of organic form in metalwork and the design, the way that the structure of the architecture is designed. We look into furniture design. And are you guys seeing a lot of this kind of sense of organic nature in the structure itself? There's very clean, beautiful lines, a really strong awareness of the natural world in this kind of fantastic elegance. And in this case, the human figures are abstracted slightly, but they still feel like they could exist in an idealized natural setting. Alphonse Mucha does several design series where he's celebrating the passage of time in nature with kind of a personification or anthropomorphization of natural progression. Typically he uses young women as his models, but he's referencing really old, ancient stories like Circe, and the abduction of her daughter Persephone by Hades, and that's how we get the passage of seasons. And Alphonse Mucha will reference these old stories. So it's a very different perspective from the Italian Futurism, where they are taking, Italian Futurism was trying to destroy the past, and arts and crafts and Art Nouveau are celebrating the past by bringing it forward with the symbolism of using the natural world, which I think is absolutely. I really like Art Nouveau. I doubt you can even tell, but I think it's an absolutely beautiful exploration of form in a very contemporary way. So they are abstracting natural forms, but they're applying it to the lived-in world. Let's see, I'm going to share that again. And then we get to expressionist architecture. This actually, remember the expressionists were kind of moving away from what they felt were the limits of impressionism. We get Alphonse Mucha, we get some of those other artists doing things where they are really abstracting the human form to kind of, or caricaturizing the human form, trying to express emotion. And you can imagine the difficulty of doing that with architecture. So we get a lot of dynamic architecture being built to kind of celebrate this idea of emotive energy into the manufactured world. And I think one of the expressions that came out of this was the Bauhaus, and Bauhaus and Le Corbusier really defined how we see modernist architecture today and modernist design. But I want to share this with you, just a brief explanation of the Bauhaus. We do have time, so try not to nod off anybody.
For many artists, architects, and historians, the Bauhaus is a symbol of modernism and artistic ingenuity. However, to the vast majority of people, the Bauhaus seems like a rather peculiar and short-lived German art school. Honestly, both views are accurate. Let's take a closer look at the Bauhaus in this video. If you'd like to see more design videos, be sure to give us a like and tell us which topics you want to learn about next. During its heyday, the Bauhaus was a cradle of modern design. The founder of the school was the modernist architect Walter Gropius. On the one hand, he had created an entirely new type of school with the Bauhaus, where students could be turned into masters. On the other, he helped to turn the Bauhaus into a kind of free-for-all experimental laboratory. School always had a unique atmosphere. As Gropius's dream of a community of designers, apprentices, and craftsmen became a reality, the school grew into a kind of commune. People from different backgrounds all lived in close proximity to one another. They worked together, partied together, and shared ideas with one another. As a result, many people viewed the school as a kind of secular cult or even sect. For example, one of the main masters of the school, Johannes Itten, had a magnetic effect on the students. His supporters were primarily concerned with physical and spiritual cleansing. They saw their path to self-knowledge and meditation. Itten believed that in order to remove the veil of the false world and see the truth, it was necessary to prepare the body with the help of vegetarianism, exercise, fasting, and enemas. At one point, the students of Itten carried out their ritualistic body cleansing in the city fountain of Weimar.
Okay, I'm just going to interject right now. I will not be teaching here anymore the point that when Utah Tech starts requiring us to have enemas, that's it. I'm out. I'm not going to join a church that requires that. I'm not going to be in a school that requires that. I'm just saying. So, take it for what it's worth.
Which led to conflicts with the city administration. As a result, Walter Gropius relieved Itten from his post in 1923, forcing him to leave the school for good. Itten was not the only master who acted as both an artist and a prophet. Many of the school's teachers held complex philosophical views and sometimes unwittingly bewitched their students. In addition to its philosophical and political effects, the Bauhaus was notorious for its outrageous parties. Gropius supported the idea that theater shows, lectures, poetry, music, and costume parties should all be part of the training program. In his opinion, rest and relaxation were no less important for creative thinking than work. Oskar Schlemmer, who had held the position of head of the theater workshop since 1923, offered an answer for the peculiar holidays. He believed that play was the power that made creativity possible. Schlemmer used parties as an experimental stage for his workshop. The most famous product of the workshop was a triadic ballet, where the structure of the human body was destroyed with the help of complex volumetric geometric costumes, turning a human into a puppet. The Bauhaus parties never lost their moments of madness, but when the school moved to Dessau, the parties took on an increasingly professional tone. Despite its bizarre and challenging reputation, the Bauhaus fundamentally changed the world of design, especially when it came to furniture. In the 14 years of its existence, the school students created many legendary designs. One of the most famous products created at the school was the Basil chair by Marcel Lajos Breuer. This chair was very much liked by Wassily Kandinsky. Decades later, when Breuer relaunched the mass production of these chairs in Italy in the 1960s, he paid tribute to the artist and renamed the chair Wassily. The most famous example of female creativity at the Bauhaus came from Mary Ann Brandt in her legendary teapot. At its core, the teapot was made to be functional. The spout prevents the drops from rolling down, while the wooden handle was heat resisted. That said, Brandt didn't forget to make it aesthetically pleasing. In fact, Brandt liked her original design so much that she made several versions of the product from different materials: toneback alloy, silver, and nickel-plated silver. Walter Gropius's dream that, as in the Middle Ages, architecture would be the final product of the synthesis of arts. At the first major Bauhaus exhibition in Weimar in 1923, a group of students, George Mucci, Gunther Steisel, Alma Seedhoff-Buescher, and Marcel Breuer, built the Haus am Horn as a reflection of a new way of life. To show the versatility of his project, Gropius even shot a promotional video about what a modernist lifestyle should look like. The main architectural project of the Bauhaus was the school building itself in Dessau, designed by Walter Gropius. It was an ode to the functionalism and machine aesthetics of the 20th century. The building also served as an advertisement for goods produced under the Bauhaus patent.
So have you guys heard about the Bauhaus before? Okay, some of you have. All right. What is remarkable to me is that it looks so unusual, and it departs so thoroughly from what people were expecting. It does fit into that expressionist perspective. And what was fascinating is that what they were doing was not trying to destroy the old, but they were trying to, someone like Pete Mondrian, parse down, dissect, and find the most fundamental principles of the old and then apply them into a new world. So even though we can see some resonance perhaps with the use of shapes like that teapot and things with what the Futurists were doing, it was a completely different perspective. And I think it was absolutely fascinating. Like Corbusier is one of the artists that I have you look at. There's this idea of, proportion of the human form. How many heads tall is the body generally in Western art?
7.
7, and it varies. If it's fashion, it's like it can be like 9 to 11 heads. If it's you'll look at some of the classical artwork coming from North Africa, the head, it's a lot more like 10, 11, 12 heads high. It's this very specific form, and we can see this kind of canonization of the human body with like Egyptian art, different things like that, classical Roman art. And Le Corbusier was looking at all that, and he established a canon for the human form that was based on rationality and intellect, that was direct reference to Egyptian, Roman, and Renaissance canonizations. And then he also used that as a fundamental ruler or yardstick for furniture design and house construction. And he was a big part of the Bauhaus. And I thought that was fantastic, trying to update thousands of years of human history and bringing it into a contemporary vocabulary. Then another artist, well, if we look at Prairie, this is considered to be the first architectural style of North America, of the United States in particular. And everybody will know who this is. You're familiar, I'm sure, with prairie style architecture. Let me pull up a couple things here. Okay, prairie style architecture, I think I can best explain it with these stained glass window designs, because this kind of style of design is carried through with the houses that, you know, the fairy godfather of prairie style, Frank Lloyd Wright, incorporated into all of his structures. He was also very heavily influenced. He actually traveled to Mesoamerica, and he saw the Tlaloc edifices from the temples. Tlaloc was the god of rain and abundance for a lot, several Mesoamerican cultures. Having his birth in Olmec times, going through the Maya, and as well as showing up quite a bit very strongly in Aztec. But I want you to look at these kind of window designs, and then I want to also share with you, let's see. When how many of you have been to BYU campus and seen the Harold Bealey Library? Have any of you guys seen that? It was built in the late 60s, early 70s, that time period, and it was intended to be a pastiche of Frank Lloyd Wright and prairie style. Let's see if I can find a picture of it. Oh no, they destroyed the view with the front facade. Okay, so forget that I was saying anything about that. But Frank Lloyd Wright was enamored of Mesoamerican style, particularly architecture around Tlaloc. Tlaloc has these goggles, and he is a predominant facet of deity for a lot of Mayan architecture and a lot of Aztec architecture. So we get this kind of uniquely American style of pyramids construction, as well as architecture. And then looking at these kinds of motifs that he designed and incorporated into his buildings, the reason this gives it the name of prairie style. When you look at this window, you see these strong diagonals, these upper reaching diagonals with the central shaft. This is because these are all abstractions to varying degrees of American wheat and rye. Can you see that, the ryegrass in this design? And then right next to it is we have this design. This is also another wheatgrass kind of design. And it starts moving towards the other thing that he really used quite a bit, which was wisteria. And you can see that kind of showing up, this floral design of the wisteria, which is usually diagonals coming from above, dripping down, like in this. And then the ryegrass, which is the diagonals moving upwards, rye and wheat. And that's where the prairie style got its name. And then we move out to California. Let's see. And we get these two architects named Green and Green. They were the Green brothers. And they started building architecture that was a celebration of that kind of West Coast Orientalism. And this is where we start. So let me grab. And I'll share this with you. All right. Can you guys see that image? Okay. This is also prairie style because it has to do specifically with the American natural landscape. And can you kind of see elements of the Art Nouveau in the way that the wood is formed? That you have a little bit of that organic nature, where Frank Lloyd Wright was really, and the Chicago kind of school of prairie style was really interested in that formalist geometric abstraction of rye and wisteria. Green and Green were really interested and fascinated with the application of tree forms, specifically ginkgo and Japanese maple. So that's what I'm talking about, the West Coast Orientalism, where they brought in a lot of flavor from Japanese and Chinese plant forms. So you get the Japanese maple, which is a standard for the bonsai kind of tree. You also see a lot of cherry type blossom, and you can kind of see that in the twisting way that the trunk of this tree is formed. And they were trying to tie in both the natural forms with this kind of twisted form of the bonsai, the kind of twisted fruit forms that you see in the cherry blossoms. And so it is, even though it looks rather different from what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing, they are dealing with the same kind of landscape, the same history. And you can see that their forms are related, but it is quite a bit, it brings in a lot more of that organic nature. You see that the ginkgo leaves. And so there's some really interesting stuff going on where the Green and Green were incorporating ideas from what Frank Lloyd Wright was doing, as well as Art Nouveau, some Art Deco, where it's this stylized, I would say it's almost like stylized hopefulness. And that's what I really enjoy about comparing these two different takes. They were contemporary to each other, so Futurism and these architectural styles that we looked at are side by side and living in the same world with each other. But I think they demonstrate quite different perspectives on how the world is and how the world should potentially be. Futurism, very definitely we can see its links to Cubism, but I think with its desire to destroy the old rather than to grow from the old, it really led into a style of art that kind of destroyed that hopefulness that I think art really needs to have to keep it going. Yeah, we can see the armored train. It was all the bright colors shooting shooting explosions of the seeds of the future into the people as it went by. That's not really kind of the hopefulness that I look for in art, which I hope you guys don't either. But then we compare that with the contemporaries to those Italian futurists that were incorporating organic forms that they saw around them, and really supreme craftsmanship and building demonstrations of what that new world might look like as moving into the future, but growing solidly out of the past, not trying to destroy the past. And then we can see that with the birth of prairie style in the Americas with the Green and Green style bungalow. And I have some videos for you that I'll put on, as well as the Frank Lloyd Wright homes. They feel very modern, but they also feel very beautifully linked to that kind of delicate history of the past. Do you guys see that as well in these kinds of forms? Okay, excellent, good, I'm glad. So I will, what you have right now is the futurism and some of that architecture. So I will put up some more of those videos online as well after we sign off for tonight, so you can see that. But take your time and look at that and see if you can see some of those kind of principles that I'm seeing as well. All right, before we close tonight, any thoughts or reactions to the two different? These are very different things. They take place in the same time period, but they're very different ways of looking at the world. Any thoughts or responses to what we've seen so far? Yeah, Joey.
Oh, I got to turn my microphone on. Hey, so I love that, you know, arts and crafts movement, you know, Bauhaus. They also had, as part of the movement, they had sort of like an idea about the type of life you were supposed to live, the environment that you were in. You know, like arts and crafts, prairie style, like the interiors are very simple. They're simplified and beautiful. And, you know, you're sort of meant to simplify your life to sort of also fit the aesthetic that you live in, that sort of thing. So,
yeah, it's really kind of, there's a couple of competing ideas going on that I think lead to that hoped for result. You look at Art Nouveau, and it was trying to simplify the workaday life by bringing in the natural world. And you do get a lot of this delicate complexity, but the idea behind the complexity in the design was to kind of lose yourself in it and to not see it anymore, but to feel it. And then you by the time you get to the Bauhaus and the Expressionist architecture, that's where you start really seeing that simplified life, like Joey's talking about, in the very design and structure itself. And then you move across the Atlantic to the Americas. Prairie style was trying to do the same thing, but using a visual American language, you know, distinctly American language. So linking it to the natural landscape and primarily California and the prairies. You know, that's why it was called prairie style. So Frank Lloyd Wright would build his homes with very contemporary engineering and very modernist shapes. If you look up his home, Falling Water, and look at the video that I have of his architecture, you can see that. But they're parsed down and not meant to intimidate you. It's meant, again, to simplify your life, like Joey's talking about. And then Green and Green, they were the pioneers of this idea of the relatively open concept living room, more expansive rooms where the craftsman and the wood and the materials are used specifically to shine, where simplified life is found in kind of this American take on Japanese wabi-sabi, where beauty is found in simplicity. And I love that in counterpoint to that celebration of almost the near violence of movement that we see with the Futurists. So these guys were very contemporary, but you can really see why the Allies didn't get along with the Axis powers, because they have very different perspectives on the world. And it's one of those things where we can see how art informs and impacts worldviews, and how those worldviews can really butt heads, you know, quite strongly. Any other perspectives on what we've seen? All right. Well, like I said, after we're done, I'll put up the rest of the videos. And please watch them all so you can get a sense for what we're talking about. And then I will look forward to seeing you guys next week. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. And Van, I'm sorry for keeping you up past your bedtime. I hope you rest well so that you're in a good mood tomorrow. But take care of yourselves, and I look forward to seeing you guys next week.
See you. Thank you.
Bye.
We'll see ya.
Thank you.
You're welcome.